On a foggy June morning in 1919, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown clambered from their Vickers Vimy, bringing to an end a grueling 16-hour, 1,900-mile flight through dense fog, freezing rain, ice, hail, and surviving a near-fatal spin. Their journey from Newfoundland to Clifton on the west coast of Ireland secured them the legacy of being the first to make a non-stop transatlantic flight, winning them £1 million prize, a place among aviation's immortals, and to be celebrated as heroes by a war-weary country. Yet their triumph wasn't a solitary stroke. It was the climax of a grueling race, a contest of nerve, ingenuity, and fragile machines that drew aviators from Britain, America, and beyond, each chasing glory. Most crashed, ditched, or never left the ground, their dreams undone by faltering engines, savage winds, or sheer misfortune, while others stood poised to fly, only to be outpaced by Alcock and Brown's combination of skill, luck, and balls-out courage. This is the story of those overlooked pioneers, and in particular, two individuals willing to risk their lives so that the pride and honor of their country would be upheld. So put your goggles on, kick the tires, and light the fires. This is the story of the fantastic Hawker and Grieve, men of a different era. The Transatlantic Challenge was born in 1913, when Lord Northcliffe, the Daily Mail's press titan of the world's largest newspaper, or as some called him, the Napoleon of Fleet Street, dangled a £10,000 prize, roughly £1 million as of 2025, to be awarded to whomever completed the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic. Northcliffe's bounties had already proved that offering cash incentives worked, or at least offering a strong motivation for daredevils to take to the skies. And of course, no doubt, a way to gain publicity for the newspaper and swell sales. He had first offered £1,000 to the first British pilot to take a British aircraft and fly 1 mile. This was followed by another £1,000 prize for the first flight across the Channel, won by Louis Blériot in 1909 in a monoplane, earning him both the money and everlasting fame. Then, in 1911, a further £1,000 prize was awarded to Jean-Louis Connu for winning the Circuit of Britain air race, a 1,000-mile slog that tested both the endurance of the pilot and the machine. But the Atlantic crossing dwarfed these feats, a 1,900-mile gauntlet of storms, fog, no landmarks, ice and freezing rain where pilots relied on compasses, sextants, and dead reckoning, in nothing more than wooden canvas biplanes powered by water-cooled engines prone to overheating or choking. There was no shortage of early entrants that included famous aviators of the day, like Gustav Hamel, who announced in May 1914 that he intended to attempt to win the race, flying a specially built monoplane, and Lieutenant John C. Port in a Curtiss flying boat, while names like Gordon England, Herr Rumpler, Samuel Cody, and even the Blériot firm circled the prize. However, Gustav Hamel vanished over the Channel in May 1914 on a routine flight from Paris to Hendon, and World War I's outbreak that August halted all plans. In February 1919, with the war having ended a few months prior, the Daily Mail wasted no time and revived its prize, tweaking the rules slightly. Anybody except enemy flyers could enter, and flights could be made in either direction. If a seaplane were used, it could alight on the sea and still be eligible if it took off and completed the flight without outside aid, but there was a 72-hour limit. Let's be honest, how many of us wouldn't have been up for the challenge given the opportunity? Newfoundland was picked as the takeoff spot, being considered as the most ideal, or to be more specific, the Avalon Peninsula on Canada's most eastern tip was selected for being just 1,900 miles from Ireland. However, had they known how wet, rocky, and prone to be shut in by heavy fog, they may have reconsidered their choice. The RAF leased Mount Pearl, just south of the town of St. John's for an airfield, but the rocky, uneven site demanded costly leveling. The Air Ministry offered the field to competitors, warning it needed work, prompting firms like Vickers, Sopwith, and Handley Page to carve their own strips amid Newfoundland's bogs and pines. 11 teams entered, but 6 dropped out before takeoff, or had their plans ruined by technical gremlins, funding shortages, or sheer bad fortune. The first entry to the competition was made by Captain Arthur Payne and Austin Herson with a 4-engine Whitehead biplane, who planned to fly east-west from Feltham to Newfoundland with a stop at Galway, but from whom not a word concerning their plans was ever heard. The Whitehead firm, which many claim to have beaten the Wright brothers in achieving sustained powered flight, was teetering on bankruptcy, faced a winding-up petition suggesting their bid was a desperate final act. Then there was the Alliance Seabird, designed and flown by J.W. Peters, which was a cabin biplane, its pilot inside peering through a periscope to cut drag and fatigue, like Lindbergh's latest Spirit of St. Louis. Equipped with dual wireless sets for communication and navigation, it missed the race but flew 900 miles from London to Madrid in July 1919, although a second Seabird crashed chasing an Australian prize, killing its crew. The first attempt came from Major Christopher Wood and Captain C.C. Wiley, flying a specially built variant of the Short Shirl, a single-engine torpedo bomber named the Shamrock, and completed at Rochester at the end of March 1919. The Shamrock had an increased wing area and a large external 435-gallon fuel tank. Its single Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 engine gave the aircraft a range of at least 3,200 miles. Interestingly, the tank was shaped like a torpedo and fitted with a quick emptying device so that the tank could be converted to a lifeboat if the aircraft had to make a forced landing. Uniquely, they flew east to west, facing headwinds, launching from Eastchurch, England on April 18, 1919, aiming for Curragh Island, from where the Atlantic attempt was to start. 4 hours out, past Holyhead, off the North Wales coast, their Rolls-Royce Eagle stalled, an airlock clogging the fuel line. Pilot Major Wood turned back to try and glide to land, but was forced to ditch a few miles offshore, being picked up by a passing trawler. The Shamrock, with its fuel tanks emptied, floated for 22 hours before being towed to the local harbour. It was hoped that the Shirl was salvageable, the crew vowing another attempt, but alas, it was not to be. In the end, only 5 teams made it to the starting line in Newfoundland with serious intentions to attempt the crossing, 4 from Britain and a formidable American team backed by the US Navy. Following the armistice, Thomas Sopwith, head of the Sopwith Aviation Company, decided they would also build an aircraft to compete for the £10,000 prize. In the 5 years since the prize was first offered in 1913, aircraft with much greater range had been developed. As Tom Sopwith put it, 1,880 miles was no longer an obstacle. George Carter, who later designed the Gloucester Meteor and Javelin, used the Sopwith B-1 bomber as the template for their transatlantic aircraft. There was a brief debate about whether to build a sea or land plane, but ultimately it was decided that a land plane would be best. Construction of the Sopwith Atlantic took just 6 weeks. The aircraft measured 31 feet 6 inches in length, with a wingspan of 46 feet 6 inches, and was powered by a Rolls-Royce Eagle 8 water-cooled V12 engine, delivering 360 horsepower, one of the finest engines of its time. The single engine would give the Sopwith Atlantic a cruise speed of 105 miles an hour, consuming 15 gallons of Shell petrol per hour, with the top speed of 118 miles per hour. It could carry 1,500 liters, almost 400 gallons of fuel, just enough for the 25-hour flight expected to cross the Atlantic. At first, like many, I thought relying on a single engine was a huge risk. However, after reading various sources from the time and Harry Hawker's book, Our Atlantic Attempt, he explains the logic behind this choice. The thinking was that on a long flight like the Atlantic crossing, multiple engines meant more fuel, more weight, and ultimately more strain on the aircraft. If one engine failed, it would add dead weight for the others to carry, along with the extra support hardware and piping for those engines. So while multi-engine aircraft were thought to be safer for long-distance flights, the supposed advantage was largely an illusion. In reality, both single and multi-engine aircraft needed all engines functioning to remain airborne. In that sense, they faced the same risks if an engine failed. The aircraft was test flown a few times at Brooklands Airfield with the engine fitted with a 4-bladed propeller, which was changed for a 2-bladed prop for the crossing attempt. In one air test, it had stayed aloft for over 9 hours, and on another occasion covering more than 1,800 miles. The Daily Mail described such details as how the two men would take their meals from boxes prepared containing easily digestible food. The two men sit side by side, but conversation is next to impossible owing to the noise of the Rolls-Royce, but doubtless they will hold many conversations of a sort. The Sopwith Atlantic had a few ingenious features, one of the most notable being its jettisonable undercarriage designed to reduce drag. This was suggested by Sopwith's test pilot Harry Hawker, an interesting, cheerful character to say the least, and the pilot chosen to make the crossing. Already a famous pilot and a crowd favorite at air shows, he'd made a name for himself competing in numerous air races, where his daring flying and showmanship had become the stuff of legend. His principle was simple. Aside from takeoff and landing, the undercarriage was just dead weight, weighing 450 pounds, created unnecessary resistance and added useless mass to haul. With it, they could only fly 105 miles on 15 gallons of petrol, but Hawker calculated that without it, they could manage 112 miles, a significant saving. So the undercarriage had to go. Instead, the aircraft relied on skids fitted to the underside of the fuselage, reinforced with long wooden runners. When the engine was cut, the 2-bladed propeller would stop horizontally to avoid damage to the engine during a landing. A windmill generator was fitted to power the Type 55A wireless set, supplied by the Air Ministry, which was supposed to have a range of 200 miles. The first set failed upon arrival in Newfoundland, forcing them to send a telegram home requesting a replacement. Unfortunately, by the time the new set arrived, there wasn't time to test it in the air. With the improvised runway at St. John's considered too risky for multiple takeoffs and landings, they ultimately decided the aircraft was more important than an operational wireless. They also had a directional wireless apparatus to aid in navigation, but during testing at Brooklands, it was found to be practically useless due to interference from the engine magnetos, so it was thrown out. George Carter also designed a detachable lifeboat built into the rear upper decking of the fuselage, just behind the crew compartment. Along with watertight survival suits, the crew was well prepared in case they had to ditch into the sea. Perhaps too prepared, as other teams jokingly teased them about their abundance of survival gear. Harry Hawker and his navigator Kenneth Mackenzie Mac Grieve, a phlegmatic Scot with a Rolls-Royce engineer, left England aboard the ship Digby on the 20th of March, with the Atlantic dismantled and packed away in crates and boxes, arrived in Placentia Bay on the west coast of the Avalon Peninsula on the 28th of March 1919. The crates and boxes were transported across the island on a primitive railway to the settlement of St. John's, arriving 2 days later, and setting up camp at Mount Pearl, 6 miles from the town. Each of the teams had to employ local men to remove rock walls, fences, fill in ditches, and flatten uneven mounds of earth to try and make the fields remotely usable as airstrips. Even so, despite the hard work, the makeshift bumpy fields made the aerodromes of Hendon and Brooklands seem flat and smooth as billiard tables. Not ideal, but this was the best they could manage. The aircraft took about a week to put together inside a makeshift hangar, and once assembled, the men were ready to go in a matter of hours. Should the weather lift, enough time to fill up their tanks, throw the mailbags in, and make sure they had their thermos flasks filled with tea. But the weather during April refused to comply. However, they did manage to make their first test flight on the 10th of that month, which incidentally was also the first aircraft to fly in Newfoundland. During preparations to prevent the engine water from freezing in the cold of the Newfoundland climate, they had to repeatedly empty and refill the circulation system, something that would come back to haunt them later. On April 11th, the second team, consisting of Frederick Freddie Raymond and Captain Charles Fairfax Fax Morgan, with their single-engined Martin's-side Raymer, a biplane named through the combination of the first syllable of each of their last names, Raymore. During the First World War, Captain Fairfax Morgan earned the Distinguished Service Order and the Croix de Guerre, although it cost him one of his legs when a bullet hit him. Morgan was considered a very popular man and a fine pilot. He'd already been to Newfoundland to scout for an appropriate piece of land to use as an airfield, but on that boat trip he'd contracted influenza and was hospitalized. During his recovery, he had several conversations with up-and-coming journalist Joseph Smallwood, who was covering the air race extensively for the Evening Telegram. Morgan told Smallwood that he would need flat land for a runway, prompting him to arrange a site alongside Quiddy Viddy Lake. Once Morgan felt better, he trudged through the snow to inspect the field. While it was far from ideal, he deemed it suitable. It was the best piece of available land. And with that, he returned to England to fetch Frederick Freddie Raymond and the aircraft. Raynham and Morgan quickly set up shop on their patch of land, which was not too far from Hawker's airfield. It was more than a month before Alcock and Brown arrived, with the fourth team led by Rear Admiral Mark Kerr and his Handley Page arriving around the same time. His team would spend much of the year tinkering with their machine, never satisfied it was ready to go. At the time, Newfoundland, and St. John's in particular, was hardly a hub of activity, offering little in the way of diversion. While waiting for the weather to improve, Harry Hawker and Greaves tested their life raft and immersion suits in a local lake. Morgan was reported to have said about Hawker and Greaves' survival equipment, "I'm afraid those life-saving gadgets are of little use. For myself, I've decided that I may as well take one deep breath if we strike the sea. We will be a very small speck in a big ocean out there." Both transatlantic crews stayed at the same lodgings, the estimable Cochrane Hotel in St. John's, which Hawker nicknamed the Cockroach, despite the rooms being spotlessly clean and the maids impeccably dressed. Hawker and Raynham had known each other from pre-war Brooklands, and were in Hawker's words best friends, although Raynham would say they were rivals, having competed in various air races, with Hawker always seeming to pip him to the post. On one occasion, Raynham had finished a 100-mile race 37 seconds behind Hawker. On another occasion, Raynham was competing for the British Empire Michelin Trophy and its accompanying £500 prize awarded to the British pilot who remained the longest in the air in an all-British aircraft in one flight between sunrise and 1 hour after sunset. In 1912, Raynham had taken off from Brooklands in an Avro biplane, settling in for hours of monotonous circuits. It was supposed to be a test of endurance. Partway through, he was joined by Hawker in a Sopwith biplane. The two aircraft flew at almost the same speed throughout the afternoon, lap after lap, an orbiting jewel in the skies. Eventually, Raymond's engine, low on oil, began to run rough, forcing him to land. He had been in the air for 7.5 hours, but Hawker kept flying. Around and around he went, the sun beginning to set, and still he circled. When darkness fell, he was still in the air. Only after 8 hours and 23 minutes did he finally land. Raynham had been robbed of victory once again. For 1 hour and 35 minutes, he had been number 1. Now he was number 2. Now competing for one of the biggest prizes of the day, the teams weren't just watching the weather, they were watching each other. But there was more at stake than money or fame. National pride was on the line. They saw themselves, first and foremost, as ambassadors of British aviation. Constant suspicion simply wouldn't do it. It wasn't gentlemanly. So they made a pact. Whichever team decided to depart would give the other at least a few hours' notice. This had the benefit of cooling down the tension and giving them time to notify the wireless operators to alert the ships along the way that the aviators had departed. In any event, for a flight that would take anywhere up to 25 hours, what matter would a few hours make? And if they got away together, they would keep each other company. There, problem solved. And so they settled in to watch the skies rather than each other. However, they didn't need to watch each other. The stakes were raised when the US Navy's 3 Curtiss NC flying boats arrived at Trepassey at the other end of the Avalon Peninsula on the 11th of May. The American aircraft, designed for anti-submarine patrols, with 4 400 HP Liberty engines, aimed to reach Plymouth, England, via the Azores and Lisbon, taking the southerly route with better weather across the ocean. The British crews were keenly aware of the Americans, making the waiting game all the more tense. Although the US team wasn't competing for the Daily Mail prize, they were determined to be the first to fly across the Atlantic. Nothing more, nothing less, and they meant to get there first, whatever it took. For all intents and purposes, they were going very soon. For this, the American effort did not lack anything. They had planned everything, and lavishly so. Trepassey, usually home to 600 residents, was now home to 8,000 American sailors, and any risk of aircraft being lost was almost entirely avoided by the fact they were in constant touch by wireless with a large number of vessels, nearly 100, including battleships and destroyers, which the US Navy had sent out to mark the course with a ship every 50 miles across the Atlantic to act as guides. Then, on the evening of Friday, 16th of May, the 3 US Navy Curtiss NC flying boats got away. The 4 men anxiously waited all day long for the news. On Saturday evening, they were told that the 3 seaplanes had safely arrived at the Azores. Their only consolation was that the British machines were fast and the American machines were slow. However, if the Americans left the Azores before they could lift off, the speed advantage for Hawker and Raynham would cease to exist. Now they knew there was only one thing to do: get as much sleep as possible, because come what may, tomorrow they were going. On the morning of Sunday the 18th of May, the skies were cloudless, but the weather reports were definitely unfavorable, more so than they had been on many previous occasions. Ironically, Britain was experiencing one of her best springs ever, but they had to take their chance without hesitation. The honor of being the first was now more important than the prize money. Monty Fenn, the manager of the Sopwith team and the last man to speak with Hawker before takeoff, later reflected on Hawker's state of mind. Confident in the aircraft and the 2 men, Fenn told a newspaper, "I don't say that the news of the Americans did not influence him, because he was so intensely patriotic a man that he wanted the honor to go to England." So the Sopwith Atlantic and the Martinsyde Raymer were prepared. The tanks were filled, oil topped up, letters from mailbags split between Hawker and Raynham were loaded, cinema film checked, food packed, and flasks of hot tea stored. By the afternoon, both crews were ready to go. Goodbyes had been said to all their new friends. Hawker, who would be taking off first, asked for a last message to be passed on to his friend Raynham, saying, "I'll greet him at Brooklands," also adding that the great problem is to find Ireland, but I have every confidence in Grieve. Watched by a small crowd from St. John's, and with the Atlantic's Rolls-Royce engine nicely warmed up, Hawker and Grieve climbed into their machine. Once in, he waved the chocks away, opened the throttle, and lined up for the takeoff run. The cheers of the spectators were quickly drowned out by the roar of the engine as the aircraft bumped and rattled over 300 yards above uneven ground. They struck a hummock and at last lifted off the makeshift airfield at 5:42 p.m., missing a fence and a drainage ditch at the end by inches. Within 3 minutes, climbing steadily, they passed over where Raynham's aircraft sat preparing to go, now being watched by a large crowd. Hawker jettisoned the heavy undercarriage at 1,500 feet as they cleared the coast of Newfoundland. The sudden weight loss caused the airspeed indicator to jump by 7 miles per hour. 5 minutes later, they reached 4,000 feet and disappeared from view. Now more streamlined, the Atlantic continued to climb to 10,000 feet. They settled into a steady cruise, heading east into a clear blue spring sky. Everything was going smoothly. Meanwhile, Alcock and Brown were still in Newfoundland, waiting for the cratered Vimy to be reassembled. On the ground over at Raynham and Morgan's airfield, word had gotten out that they were also going to depart. Since the Raymer was slightly faster than the Sopwith, they could afford a little time. Once ready, they clambered into their Rolls-Royce Falcon-powered biplane, now heavy with full fuel tanks and other paraphernalia. They started their engine and began their Atlantic attempt, lining up for takeoff. Raynham opened the throttle, and the aircraft started to roll forward. During flight testing, with a strong headwind and light fuel load, the Raymer could lift off in just a few dozen meters. But unfortunately, now with the winds behind them, they were not able to gain sufficient lift to take off, and still after 300 yards they were still stuck to the ground until they hit a bump that made the Raymer bounce into the air and then come crashing back to earth, the force of the impact destroying the undercarriage. The Raymer skidded to a halt, end of the line. Raynham cut both the engine and fuel supply, climbing out with only a few cuts and bruises, saying to a reporter, "Well, that's the end of a perfect day." So ended his challenge for now. However, Morgan was not so lucky, losing sight in his left eye and thus ending his flying career. Meanwhile, despite taking off into blue skies, within 15 minutes Hawker and Grieve flew into Newfoundland's infamous fog. Fortunately, Greaves was able to get drift readings through gaps in the cloud that formed a perfectly flat horizon, along with half-hourly sextant readings. After flying for 4.5 hours and averaging 91 miles per hour, they were confident that they were over the steamer lane. They decided to follow it as best they could. It can be argued that at the time, many brave men could have flown across the Atlantic given the right aircraft and engines, but few could have navigated their way across. Grieve had to rely on celestial navigation and dead reckoning, challenging enough in ideal conditions, but made even harder by hours of thick cloud cover that obscured the stars. When the skies finally cleared, he was forced to remove his gloves in the freezing cold to use his sextant in the buffeting slipstream. Working quickly to avoid frostbite, his silk liners, worn between the thermal gloves for extra protection, had been blown overboard earlier in the night. On short flights, a navigation error of 5 degrees might put you a few miles off course. Over a few thousand miles, it could be catastrophic. When the American seaplanes were making their flight to the Azores, they ran into a fog bank. After 170 miles of flying by dead reckoning alone, they were 45 miles off course. Without a doubt, the navigator's role was as critical to the success of these long-distance flights as either the pilot or the machine was. To quote Hawker, "The pilot owes everything to the navigator." By 10 p.m., almost 5 hours into the flight, having traveled 450 miles, and had only seen the sea once in that time, the sky started to turn from a dark blue to purple, and up ahead, the clouds had started to build, with the weather turning for the worse. With heavy rain squalls and strong northerly winds, their only chance was to try and climb above them. But just as he was about to ascend, Hawker noticed the water circulation thermometer was reading a little higher than it ought to have been. Hoping to reduce the temperature, he opened the radiator shutters a little, but this made no difference. Not wanting to irritate the temperature further, Hawker decided that instead of trying to outclimb the clouds, he would try and fly around them. Now, flying in the moon's light, the temperature had climbed from 75 degrees Celsius to 80 degrees Celsius in a few minutes. Although the Rolls-Royce engine was purring away without any issues, the temperature stayed there for the next few hours. Hawker knew he needed to do something about the rising water temperatures. He realized the issue wasn't just heat, it was the water boiling away. He came to the conclusion that some solder or rust had likely worked its way loose and was blocking the cooling line or the water filter. He knew that one way to clear the blockage was by stopping the engine and nosediving the aircraft. This way, any gloop would spread itself at the bottom of the filter instead of over it. So with that in mind, Hawker switched off the engine, pushed the nose down from 12,000 feet, descending to about 9,000 feet, where he restarted the engine, and to their relief, the temperature had reduced and was holding at a reasonable level, and so they were climbing again. However, this was not ideal, having to continuously perform this maneuver, and with the wind against them, they would quickly eat into their petrol reserves, and only an hour later at 12:30 a.m., the temperature had climbed up to 79 degrees. Hawker had no choice but to repeat the nosediving exercise, but this time luck was not on their side. For when they pulled out of the dive, back into the climb, the water temperature started to climb dangerously close to boiling point. So they tried again, but this made things rather worse, and the water in the engine began to boil. Hawker knew that in spite of the intense cold, almost 0 degrees, it wouldn't take long for the 19 gallons of water to boil away. but by some miracle, he managed to coax the engine up to 12,000 feet, then up to 15,000, and throttle as far back as possible to give the engine and water every chance. Can you imagine how tense it must have been? Both men watching the little geyser of steam spouting for the pressure release vent in the radiator, with the temperature gauge reading exactly 100 degrees Celsius. For the next 5 hours, the men flew on like this. At 6 o'clock on the morning of May 19th, they faced a wall of cloud rising to at least 15,000 feet. Climbing above it was impossible, as the water temperature would climb as they gained altitude. Flying through the cloud was out of the question, and going around it would cost them precious fuel. Reluctantly, they chose to descend to 6,000 feet. So once again, engine off and down into the dark clouds they went. Now, keep in mind, this is in the age before artificial horizons, and flying in clouds to this day without the correct instruments is pretty much an invitation to make an appointment with either St. Peter or the big red one downstairs. Descending through the freezing clouds, while little water remained in the jacket, went stone cold as soon as they stopped the engine. Now, with the ocean coming up fast, they scrambled to restart it. Hawker shouted over the wind for Grieve to get on the petrol pump. At the rate they were dropping, hitting the rough sea would be brutal. Then, by some miracle, as they skimmed just a few dozen feet above the waves, the Rolls-Royce coughed back to life, just in time. Hawker pushed the throttle open, pulled back on the wheel, and eased her way out of the dive, which Hawker claims they were only 10 feet above the sea, beginning the slow, painful climb away from the ocean. It had been a close shave, not one either man wanted to repeat. They quickly came to the conclusion that it was pointless to carry on. The water left in the engine would only last another hour or two, and reaching Ireland now seemed out of the question. The men began searching for a ship, zigzagging beneath the low clouds and dodging squalls of rain. Thanks to Grieve's meticulous navigation, they were certain they were above a steamer lane. For 2 hours they flew at 2,000 feet, the weather growing progressively worse, the wind gusting and buffeting them relentlessly. Although they had a wireless on board, the aircraft didn't have enough airspeed to spin the small windmill generator, leaving them unable to send even an SOS, although he tried sending the distress messages every 15 minutes, in the vain hope that someone would hear them. Then, suddenly out of the fog, loomed the Danish steamer, the Mary. Hawker whooped with joy. Greaves, the more reserved of the two, would later admit that he wanted to do the same, but his stoic nature prevailed. Hawker began circling the ship, firing off 3 very distress flares, keeping close until they saw the crew appear on the decks. Now, confident they had been spotted, they flew a few miles ahead, where Hawker made a textbook water landing. No doubt the absence of the undercarriage helped considerably, otherwise they most definitely would have cartwheeled into the sea. Once in the water, they quickly detached the little lifeboat, their watertight suits keeping them out of the sea, and was saved by the very survival equipment they'd been mocked for. The Mary, close by, took an hour and a half to launch her light boat and reach Hawker and Grieve, who by then were nauseous from the relentless rolling of the sea. Their aircraft semi-submerged and likely to sink to the bottom, the only item they were able to save was a single page from Greaves' notebook. Finally, the lifeboat from the Mary reached them. At 9:30 a.m. on a Monday, 14.5 hours after they left Newfoundland, they were safely aboard the Danish steamer, wet, exhausted, and without their boots. However, there was one slight problem. Mary lacked a radio, and they had no way to tell the world they were alive. That same Monday morning, as the duo were being fished out of the sea, the British newspapers were full of the news that Hawker and Grieve had taken off and on their way. With this, people started to gather at Brookslands to await their arrival. But by the early evening, with no sign of the men, they started to return home. At 10 p.m. that evening, news started to arrive that they had ditched 40 miles off the coast of Ireland. But the next day, the country woke up to a new Daily Mail headline: Hawker missing, false report of fallen in the sea. The RAF sent out aircraft and the Navy dispatched 2 destroyers to search for the men. By the Wednesday, the 21st of May, the Times ran the story: the only faint hope is that Mr. Hawker and his companion may have been taken aboard a vessel that has no wireless installation, a deficiency seldom found now in transatlantic ships. Hope for the flyers diminished. The country was becoming restless. They demanded that the government dispatch a sizable search force from Plymouth, comparing the vast force the US Navy had mounted in support of its flying boats to the lackluster efforts made by the Admiralty. Throughout all of this, Hawker's wife, Muriel, maintained that her husband was alive and well. Despite his failing health, Lord Northcliffe felt that the Atlantic race was his creation and therefore his responsibility. After meeting Muriel Hawker, he announced that the £10,000 prize money would be divided between the next of kin of Hawker and Mackenzie Grieve if they did not return. But Muriel refused to concede, stating, "They don't understand what a man of resource my husband is," she said. "Whenever the time comes for my trouble to be relieved, among my happiest duties will be that of teaching my little Pamela that her father did not hesitate to venture all for the honour of glory of his country," she added, "but I cannot and will not believe that my husband is not alive." On the 23rd of May at around 2 p.m. at mid-Atlantic, the Sopwith machine was spotted from the SS Lake Charlottesville, now floating tail high. They searched in vain for survivors before hauling the wreck out of the water. On the 24th of May, 6 days after Hawker's takeoff, a telegram of condolence was sent by King George V to Muriel, reading, "The King, fearing the worst, must now be realized regarding the fate of your husband, wishes to express his great sympathy and that of the Queen in your sudden and tragic sorrow. His Majesty feels that the nation has lost one of its most able and daring pilots who sacrificed his life for the fame and honor of British flying." The Sunday papers were gloomy. They reported that all hope had been lost. All hope, Muriel Hawker remembered later. How strange and final those words sounded. She crossed the road to the little church that stood just opposite their home. Inside, special prayers were said for Harry and Commander Grieve. After the service, she hurried back home, expecting news. Nothing. However, that morning, off the Butt of Lewis, the most northerly point of the Outer Hebrides, Chief Officer of the Coast Guard, William Ingham, was on duty that clear sunny morning, discussing the fate of Hawker and Grieve with leading seaman George Harding. They spotted a steamer coming in from the west, sounding its siren, which was unusual considering the clean weather. As she drew closer, they could see that the international code flags were being flown. First, the ship gave her name, Mary, followed by Saved Hands. The next flag message indicated that it would spell out the words in the next signal, Sop Aeroplane, to which the Coast Guard began to ask the question, "Is it?" Before the Coast Guard could finish its message, Mary spelt out the words, Hawker, yes. Dunn, the captain of the Mary, keen to get back to Denmark, kept on steaming towards home, so a destroyer, HMS Woolston, was dispatched from Scapa Flow to collect the two flyers. Once the British ships arrived, they said their farewells to the crew and boarded the destroyer. Finally, they were homeward bound. Muriel got the news just after 10 a.m., less than an hour after the Coast Guard had spotted Mary. Her faith was finally rewarded. Her phone rang. It was the Daily Mirror. They'd scooped the Daily Mail to the story of the century. A message had come in. Mr. Hawker and Commander Grieve had been rescued by a Danish ship. Could the Mirror send someone down for a private interview? Back in Hook, the neighbors hung flags. Telegraph boys came and went. Reporters showed up in droves. The Daily Mirror had its exclusive, but the story now belonged to the whole country. Special newspaper editions hit the streets by the afternoon. Hawker saved, special. All Britain went wild with the news. A nation worn thin by years of war, still raw from its wounds, had found something to cheer for. Barely 6 months after the armistice, two men had defied the odds and returned from the brink, back from the dead. Meanwhile, Hawker and Mackenzie Grieve, weary but alive, were now aboard the battleship HMS Revenge, the flagship of the home fleet. As the pair made their way down to London, they were greeted by huge crowds, welcoming them home as heroes. At Newcastle, the reception was no different. Huge crowds, more cheers. Speaking to reporters, Hawker said of Muriel, "I have been loyally backed up by my wife, and when a man embarks on an adventure of this kind, the spirit in which it is taken by his wife counts for a great deal." But it wasn't until they arrived at Grantham Station that Hawker was finally reunited with Muriel. From there, they travelled together by train to London King's Cross, accompanied by an aerial escort of airplanes, specially assembled the day before to honour their return. By the time they reached London on Tuesday afternoon, the crowds had swelled into the thousands. Among them was a contingent of Australian soldiers, still in uniform and waiting to return home after the war. Spotting their countrymen, they broke through the barricades, lifted Hawker and Grieve shoulder high, and carried them out to their car. But the crowds were too dense to go any further. Seeing the situation, a mounted policeman stepped in. Without hesitation, he dismounted, handed the reins to Hawker, and hoisted him up onto the horse. So, it was that a journey which had begun by aircraft in Newfoundland had continued by lifeboat, steamer, destroyer, battleship, express train, and car, now ended with Hawker making his final approach through a rapturous London on horseback. The next day, Hawker and Grieve were welcomed to Buckingham Palace for an audience with the king. There, both men were awarded the Air Force Cross, Hawker becoming the first civilian ever to receive the honour. Lord Northcliffe awarded them a cheque for £5,000 as a consolation prize, which they split evenly. The salvaged Sopwith Atlantic was displayed on the roof of Selfridge's department store in London, repeating the famous Blériot aeroplane 1909 rooftop display. Meanwhile, Motor Radiators Limited ran an ad in Flight magazine, proclaiming, "If Hawker had used our radiator, he'd have succeeded." Hawker claims in his book, Our Atlantic Attempt, that the blockage was quite possibly caused by constantly emptying and refilling the water from the engine while they waited for the weather to clear, causing more rust to form in the circulation system than would otherwise have been the case. At 1:45 p.m. on the 14th of June 1919, the Vimy, flown by John Alcock and Arthur Brown, took off from Leicester's Field, Newfoundland, accompanied by their mascots, Lucky Jim and Twinkletoes. 16 hours later, after an arduous flight through thick fog, enduring intense, deafening roar from an engine's broken exhaust manifold, freezing rain, ice and snow, surviving an uncontrolled spiral dive, they finally landed in an Irish bog, the first to fly non-stop across the Atlantic. As for Frederick Rainman, he rebuilt the Raymore, now renamed the Chimera, and made one final attempt on July 17th, this time with Lieutenant Beadlecombe replacing Morgan. But a crosswind caught the aircraft on takeoff, flipping it over and ending his transatlantic hopes. Disheartened, he caught the first ship back to England and continued with Martinsyde until the company folded in 1920. He later founded an air survey company in Asia, married Dodie McPherson, and eventually settled in the US, living a nomadic life on the road for 6 years before his death in 1954. He's buried in Evergreen Cemetery, Colorado Springs. John Alcock went back to Brooklyn to test airplanes, but on the 15th of December 1919, while flying a Vickers Viking to Paris for an air show, his aircraft was seen falling to earth, coming down in a farmer's field. Sir John Alcock died a few hours later, aged 27. Arthur Whitten Brown had gone on an extended honeymoon with his wife, Kathleen. On his return, he went to work in the South Wales industrial city of Swansea, working an office job for Metro Vickers, and lived a quiet life with his wife. They had one son, Arthur Buster Brown, who would go on to become an RAF pilot flying de Havilland Mosquitoes during the war. Sir Arthur Whitten Brown died in his sleep on the 4th of October 1948, aged 62. Kenneth Mackenzie Grieve, the stoic Scotsman, slipped quietly from the limelight. By the time he settled in Victoria, British Columbia, in 1929, few knew that he had once shared a cockpit with Harry Hawker in a daring dash across the Atlantic. Not until his obituary appeared in 1942 did many locals learn of his remarkable feat. He died at the age of 62, leaving behind a widow and daughter. The up-and-coming journalist Joseph Smallwood would go on to become Premier of Newfoundland, and Rear Admiral Mark Kerr and his Handley Page never attempted the crossing. The Americans made it across the Atlantic, leaving the Azores at 10:18 a.m. on the 27th of May, arriving that evening over Lisbon, touching down at 9 p.m. to the sound of a 21-gun salute from the waiting U.S. Navy ship. Taking off again a couple of days later and landing in Plymouth on the English south coast on the 30th of May. A very apt location, considering it was from where the Pilgrim Fathers had originally set sail in the Mayflower. They were greeted by an almost delirious crowd that welcomed them like superstars. The aircraft's commander, Lieutenant Commander Albert Reed, later wrote to his wife that the successful flight represented a continuous run of unadulterated luck. But indeed, the skill and bravery of the crew combined with fortuity made him and his crew the first to fly the Atlantic. As for Harry Hawker, he went back to competitive flying, attending air shows across the country. A few weeks after Alcock's death, Harry Hawker began suffering from increasing back pain. X-rays revealed tubercular damage to his spine. Though doctors recommended surgery, Hawker refused. Post-operative treatment meant months of lying flat, and even then they warned part of his spine would likely be left immobile. It would mean giving up flying and the car racing he loved. In 1920, Harry Hawker co-founded the H.G. Hawker Engineering Company with Thomas Sopwith, shifting his focus to producing parts for cars and motorcycles. Through all his daring exploits, Muriel remained by his side, even as he miraculously walked away from numerous car crashes that left her fearing the worst. Their second daughter was born on the anniversary of his transatlantic attempt with Grieve, and they named her after the Danish steamer that had rescued him, Mary. But tragedy struck on July 12, 1921. Preparing to fly the British Newport Company's Goshawk at the Hendon Air Display, Hawker reached 15,000 feet when the aircraft suddenly caught fire and plunged into a field in Burnt Oak, a London suburb. He was thrown clear of the wreckage and found some distance from the plane. He was only 32. The spirit of Harry Hawker would live on. The company he founded with Thomas Sopwith would in 1933 be renamed to Hawker Aircraft.